what inspired you to write about Franklin through your experiences? And obviously you had some things in common with him that must have drawn you to him.
Well, he was actually, to be honest, not an obvious choice of subjects for someone like myself. I was, as you said, a former foreign correspondent for NPR. I've traveled widely, lived overseas for a decade, and have always looked to foreign voices of wisdom, Mahatma Gandhi, Confucius, Socrates. But actually, a number of years ago, I was actually in Kabul, Afghanistan, covering the war there for NPR, and I dipped into a carpet shop, and the carpet dealer there, it's time to pay for my carpet, and they wanted US dollars. I gave him some 10s and 20s, and he said, no, only Franklin's, only Franklin. So even a carpet dealer in Kabul, Afghanistan knows Benjamin Franklin because he is the face on the $100 bill. And here's a fun fact, 70% of $100 bills circulate outside the US. And I kind of tucked that away, and I thought, I should know more about him. It wasn't until a few years ago, mid-pandemic, when I decided to dive deeply into Franklin and his life. A big birthday was approaching. I won't say what it was, but the number 6 featured prominently. And I was just feeling kind of unsatisfied with my life. Perhaps you've experienced that sometimes, like, some outward success, yes, but have I really done what I want to do with my life? And what do I do with the last, I hate to put it this way, but the last act of my life?
Sure.
And Franklin seemed like a pretty good role model for that. In fact, an excellent one.
So that we'll come back to that because I really like that part about him. I'm going to ask you a question about you partway through this too, because I think he had a certain he had certain characteristics to him that are just, to your point, they're uniquely Ben, they're uniquely Franklin in orientation. So just to kind of bring us to the start, teach our listeners about Ben, his influences as a child. He obviously grew up in Puritan Boston, which when we hear that, it was not long after the Salem witch trials, as you pointed out in your book. But that seems like kind of a static environment to be born into, but you pointed out it wasn't as static as people thought.
Not as puritanical as you would think the Puritans are. I mean, let's face it, okay, Puritan Boston in the early 1700s was not exactly Las Vegas, all right?
Sure.
But it was a very bookish community. In fact, the Puritans, before they sailed for Boston, they had already put together a library of some 50 books back in England. So there was a Boston library before there was a Boston. And Franklin was always very good at sort of juicing a place for everything it had to offer him. And what Puritan Boston had to offer him was books, really. We're talking before about our love of books. Franklin adored books. And it's a good thing because he only had 2 years of formal education. That's it. Before his father yanked him out of school at age 10. So how did he become such a great writer and statesman? Well, he was self-taught. And how did he do that? Through books. He would get a hold of them any chance he got. He would beg, borrow them. While everyone else was in church on Sunday, he'd sneak into his brother's print shop where they had a small library and read. He just absolutely devoured books.
So even in puritanical Boston, to your point, I think you point out that like the local whorehouse was called Prudence the Prude or something along those lines.
The prudish, what was it called? Prudish Madam of Boston, something like that.
Yeah, it was something along the line. But to your point, they're puritanical, but these are also people that ventured far from home. And I think you even point differences, like there was a difference between the North Church and the South Church. And I think you pointed out that the intellectuals floated at the North Church compared to the South Church.
Other way around.
Oh, other way around, sorry.
It was the South Church where Franklin's father, Josiah, belonged.
Okay.
And it was the contrarian church. So you have to remember, Boston at this time, the population is only about 8,000 people, right?
Sure.
And life is hard. So think of it much more, don't think of it as like Boston today. Think of it as a frontier town, almost like someplace in Alaska somewhere or whatever frontiers we have left today. It was out there. So yes, you're a Puritan, but everyone just had to do whatever they could to get by. So, I talk about the hyphenated career. You could be a barber physician. You can be, an editor, printer. Everybody had to do everything. And I'm convinced that had Josiah Ben Franklin's father not sailed over in the late 17th century from England to Boston, we would not know the name Ben Franklin. He was not going to flourish in old stuffy England. It was only in the U.S. where he could do that. Sure.
And as you pointed out, he only had 2 years of formal education. What was his original planned course from his father? And why did his father not have him continue on that?
Well, Ben had his own dreams. He wanted to be a sailor, actually. He would hang out in the harbor and talk to the sailors, and he loved the water. He was a great swimmer. And he wanted to go and see the world as a sailor. And his father was having none of it because he already lost another son to the sea, presumed dead. And so that was nixed. So his father said, well, we're going to offer you to the church. You're going to be a clergyman. And if you know anything about Ben Franklin, he was not a churchgoer.
Sure.
And he had no patience for stuffy clergy. I mean, I would not say he was an irreligious man or even an atheist. He just didn't like organized religion. And even at age 10, that came across. And I think his father realized, since so much of education then was steering you toward a career in the church, he realized that wasn't going to work out, and he needed help back at the candle and soap shop that his father ran. So he pulled him out of school.
Well, and then I think you pointed out, too, that his normal course would have been going to the Latin school there in Boston and then follow it on by going on to Harvard, like many of the clergy did at the time.
Right.
And it's weird that we think about him as a learned man, an intellectual, but to your point, he wasn't a quote-unquote educated person in a traditional sense.
He wasn't. He had the title doctor, and still today we might call him Dr. Franklin, but those were honorary degrees conferred by St. Andrews in Oxford. So, I mean, Cole, I think his lack of formal education, I think, actually turned out to be a blessing. You know, unlike Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, other founders, very well educated in a traditional sense, Franklin was forced to improvise. And sometimes being a self-taught person makes you the best taught person, right? Because he's not being fed the information; he's eating it himself, and he's going out and getting it. You know, he's hungry for knowledge, and that makes a difference. Also, I think it made him just more relatable to a wider spectrum of people once he became an adult. I mean, he could talk to anyone. He could talk to the fishmonger, the printer's apprentice, and he could talk to kings. In fact, he met 4 kings and dined with one of them, which is pretty amazing.
Sure.
So he could talk to anybody.
Sure. You mentioned that one of his favorite books was Pilgrim's Progress, which was very interesting because, like you mentioned, he was not a religious person, and many would look at that book as fairly religious, but it was a very personal story of, you know, this man with a burden, if you will.
With a burden and who goes on a journey, right? It's the pilgrim part. And I think that appealed to Franklin, that idea of going on a journey. And you're right, he was not religious, but yet he's absorbing wisdom from a religious book. So that's another brilliant thing about him. Sorry I keep talking about him in the present tense, but he's still alive to me.
Correct.
A brilliant thing about him is he could put aside what he didn't like about a person and still learn from them. He once said, you know, you should be friends with your enemies because befriend your enemies because they show you your faults. Sort of kidding, sort of not. So he was able to put aside the religious content of the book and absorb the style, the journey, the moral lessons.